Welcome to this week's HBF. I'm sure you're all loving and enjoying the sun. My plan had been to record our HBF video instead of being in this boring office out in the sunshine, and I was out doing a membership interview this afternoon and stopped by the town park thinking I would record there, but too busy, too many people, and I've come back here for a bit of peace and quiet. So as we center ourselves and remind ourselves why we gather in Home Bible Fellowships, why don't we, to open up tonight, why don't we just share what our favorite thing about Home Bible Fellowship is, and one way that we can encourage others to connect with a Home Bible Fellowship who don't connect with one that are in GBC. And then let's just pray for each other as we begin our time together tonight. Well, tonight we're going to begin digging into what was preached on Sunday morning by Nate, which is really an obscure kind of passage for us. It's parachuting straight into 2 Samuel, but let's just set the scene briefly and remind ourselves before we unpack what's going in. We're really dropping into what is a dark scene, a chaotic moment in David's life and really the life of Israel. David is no longer sitting comfortably on the throne. This is post sin with Bathsheba, if you remember rightly, as Nate shared that in the service. But you've got David sitting on the throne, not comfortably. You've got Absalom, his son. So this is Absalom is David's son, who really has rebelled against his dad and stolen the hearts of many of the people of Israel. David's been forced to flee Jerusalem, barefoot, grieving, humiliated in many ways, and absolutely vulnerable as the king of Israel. The kingdom and all of its promises that God had made and all of its security feels very unstable. And in fact, the promises of God seem threatened. But some important background that I think we need to just keep in mind at the back of our minds. You remember Nate was saying that what is really unfolding here is the promises that God had forgiven David, the sin of Bathsheba, but that the sword would never depart from Israel's house. This was a former promise that God had made, and that this would come back. The consequences would come back. And so what really is unfolding in these passages in 2 Samuel for us here tonight is really the unfolding of the consequences of David's sin from much earlier playing out. So let's recap the characters. We've got David the king fleeing, king of Israel, the rightful throne. You've got Absalom the son, who is rebelling against his father and capturing the hearts and the affections of the people. You've got Ahithophel, let me just call him A. He is really David's former counselor, but he's betrayed him and he's gone astray. And then we've got Hushai, who is David's loyal friend who has become a spy inside Absalom's camp. And so there's all this kind of political strategy, military planning, all this stuff going on in these verses. I don't want us to get overwhelmed and lost in it all, because there is some really key things that Nate brought out that I think would be really helpful for us to just slow down, cut the noise out of the passage, and focus in on the key points that Nate really brought out. His big idea was that sin is serious, his mercy is more, his sovereignty is sure, and that his salvation is sweet. So, before we go, we're not going to read the whole passage, but before we go to that, I want to just put up this big idea on the screen, and I want us to just briefly share things that come to mind when we see that big idea that we're going to unpack in this passage, and just share things that stir our affections for a good and gracious and kind and merciful God as we begin to turn to his word. So the first part really I want us to look at is just to read together 2 Samuel 16, verse 20 to 22. So read 2 Samuel 16, verse 20 to 22 together. Okay, so the main section here is really this reality that Nate brought out in the passage, that sin is serious. What we see here in these couple of verses is this public humiliation that Absalom humiliates David. Nathan really had already prophesied that these consequences would come back on him, that David's private sin would now be the public fruit that is born in his humiliation. That sin spreads and has terrible consequences. What Nate really was bringing out is the reality that the same is true today that is being shown there then. That actually the world and ourselves can often treat sin lightly. We can often minimize it and expect that, well, God is a gracious God. He's kind towards us. He is merciful. He is abounding in steadfast love. He will forgive us. And we fail to recognize the seriousness of sin, that the consequences, the scars, the wounds, the destruction in families, they still ripple on. And this is what we're seeing unfolding in the passage. So I want us to just think here in these few questions is this. Where do we see our culture treating sin lightly? Nate brought up the strange and profound quote. I mean, I thought it was unbelievable that a school would be quoted as one of their core values. I think he said it was, sin is not that big a deal, so let's not make it any more of a deal than needs to be, or something like that. I mean, I can't imagine, obviously, none of the secular schools here would say that, but can you imagine any public Christian schools saying that? But our society does treat sin like that. Is our lives also displaying that in some way? What areas do you see that true? How often are we tempted, secondly, to minimize sin in our own lives? Thinking about maybe a refusal to shine a light on someone else's struggles with sin and lovingly rebuke them and walk with them as they repent and are restored, maybe because we have our own sin struggles. Whatever it might be, what ways are we tempted to minimize sin in our own lives? And perhaps really in all that vein is, what are some of the respectable sins that quietly damage our walk with God? Let's discuss that together. As we turn to this next section of these competing voices and counsels, really riffing off of Proverbs and where we're at in Proverbs, turn to 2 Samuel 17 and let's read verses 1 to 14, 17, 1 to 14, and then we'll discuss some questions. So here in this section, what you see is two counselors, Ahithophel, or A as we're calling him, and Hushai. Not every wise-sounding voice is actually wise. Ahithophel's counsel is clever, but it is godless. And Hushai frustrates the plan. So what you see is these two voices competing for attention. Both sound reasonable, but cutting between the lines is listening and recognizing what is the voice of God in all of this. As we've been doing Proverbs together, we've been thinking about how voices shape our lives. We're all listening to 1,000 voices every day. Media, friends, podcasts, the news, culture, TV, whatever it might be. They're shaping and forming us into their image. But really what we're called to do is listen to God's word and be formed in his image. Chapter 17, verse 14 is really that key verse. The Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. So let's discuss a few questions here. What voices most compete for your attention and trust day to day? Just think about the voices that you listen to, your own voice in your mind, people, whatever it might be. What's competing for your attention day by day? What kind of advice does sound wisdom in our culture sound like, but actually is pulling people away? Think, follow your heart, do whatever makes you happy. These are phrases of advice from our culture that actually sound nice, but draw us away from God. And lastly, how do we learn to weigh the words that are coming from God's wisdom in his word, and all the other voices that are competing for that attention. How do we learn to weigh up what is sound and what is false? Let's talk about that together. Let's read 2 Samuel 17, 14 to 23, and then we're going to discuss a little bit about God's sovereignty in amongst all of life's chaos. It's interesting, on the back of this passage, we got talking in the garden after the service as we were eating barbecue together about really the sovereignty of God in the details of life. You can take it to the extreme where you say, we don't have a single choice about anything in life. We're just like robots passing through. But we know that isn't true. We know that God has given us wills, and we have the freedom to rebel against him and take the consequences, as we are in Adam, who did that in the garden. But we also have the freedom to choose to surrender our wills and become obedient to him. What we see in our verses here is that God is sovereign in all of these situations that are playing out for David. Ahithophel's downfall, God answering David's earlier prayer. God is accomplishing his purposes. So this is what I want to encourage you in this section. We often only see surface level chaos. God sees the big picture. We often only see like blinkers our own situation. But God sees all of eternity and how he's working all things out for our good and his glory. So here's a couple of questions for us. Where have you seen God's providence clearly as you look back on life that you didn't see before? What situations right now require trust rather than understanding? Let's chat about that together. Well, here in this last section, we're going to read 2 Samuel 17, verses 27 to 29. Just a couple of verses. Let's read that, and then we'll close in some discussion. So this whole section really, as we bring it to a close, is this, that God preserves his king. He had promised David to be the king on the throne, but he is not the king that the nation has longed for. We know in hindsight, in the rearview mirror, that actually David is a foreshadowing of the king that would come, the Lord Jesus, the true and better king. So in this section, what we're seeing is David weary in the wilderness. God provides through ordinary people, the beds, the food, the kindness, the hospitality. God cares in practical means. But what we really see is that all of it is pointing to a true and better king. Here's the big thing that I want us to think about here. David points beyond himself. Jesus is that true and better king. Jesus was the one that was betrayed and rejected, who was opposed, who was sent out the city. But unlike David, Jesus suffers for our sin, not his own. Nate said this, and I've got it written down here. Through the death of one man, peace comes to the nations. This is what Jesus did in fulfilling all that David pointed to. So as we bring our time in HBF to a close, I want us to just think about this. How does this passage, difficult as it is, obscure perhaps as it is, how does it help point us to appreciate Jesus more deeply? How about we just share a few things that have really stirred our affections to Jesus and what he has accomplished for us in this? Secondly, why is it important that Jesus is the better king than David? And thirdly, where do we need to remember this week that his mercy is more? We sang that at the end. Nate labored that point, that Jesus is the merciful king whose mercy is more than all the sin that is in us. Let's share these things and then let's close praying for one another.